Let's do some code review and apply some clean code principles along the way to improve readability and changeability of the code for the benefit of our teammates and the future version of us. Here's the code I want to review in this episode. It is actually pretty simple, but there are some improvements we can make, as we will see in a second. Before we do any refactoring, let's check the existing test safety net and review whether it seems to be complete. This also helps us to learn more about the intention of the code we are going to refactor. Looking at the test cases, it seems that this code operates on two exception texts. When we scroll through the test cases, we can see from the names of the test cases that the class we are going to review seems to treat different stack trace lines in a different way. For now, we will not add any further test cases, but assume that the test suite is complete. When we start reading the code, we immediately detect some simple changes we can make to improve the readability. From the test cases we have learned that this code operates on two exception texts. So let's rename the method arguments to make this learning more explicit in the code. These names might still not be great, but definitely better than data1 and data2. Let's quickly compile the code and submit the changes. Okay. Reading on, it seems that this if condition can be converted into a guard clause to reduce the indentation of this method. Let's quickly check the rest of this method, and indeed a guard clause would make sense here. First, let's negate the whole condition and immediately return from the method. Let's remove the closing curly bracket and reformat the code. Now let's simplify the condition. And before submitting this change to the version control system, we definitely want to run all the test cases to verify that the code still works as expected. All tests are green, so let's go ahead and submit the improvement. When converting the if statement, I noticed a hint by the IDE for another improvement, so let's check that again. Here, Visual Studio Code is suggesting to convert this if statement into a return statement. So let's do this. And again, let's quickly run the test cases and submit the improvement. When we move on reviewing the code, we realize some obvious code duplication. This big if condition with the regular expressions. So let's factor them out into a separate method. The new method obviously also needs a good name, explaining what it is doing. When analyzing the regular expressions again, it seems that these are trying to identify stack traces from test classes. So let's rename that method to is stack trace line from test class. Now let's use the new method in the second if as well, and also quickly review the code generated by the IDE. We can simplify that slightly further and also reformat it a bit. Okay. Now this method almost fits on a single screen page. Let's run the tests again and submit the improvement. As the intention of the code gets cleaner, we can also further improve some namings. This variable exception lines 1 is better named stack trace 1. So let's rename it. And of course we do the same with exception lines 2. We rename it to stack trace 2. We can now also see that this code is actually not formatting anything. Instead, it is filtering the stack trace. So let's rename formatted exception 1 to filtered stack trace 1. And of course we do the same with the second stack trace. As we only have renamed some variables and we did not change any logic, let's just compile the code and submit the changes. Now that it is clear that this code is actually filtering the stack trace, it feels natural to convert this code into a link queue statement to make this intention even more explicit in the code. So let's do this. And of course we apply the same refactoring to the second stack trace. Now the whole method got much more compact, that it fully fits on a single screen page. And again, let's run the test cases and submit the improvement. Oh, we failed! Let's check the test case. Well, this output is not very helpful. Let's go back to the code and see whether we can spot the problem. Okay, here's the problem. With the conversion from the for loop to a link queue statement, we also converted the result from a string builder into a list of strings. And we can obviously not compare two lists of strings by converting them into a string and then compare the result. Instead, let's do the following. We use the linQ_accept extension method and compute the difference, and we say these two filtered stack traces are the same if there isn't any difference. Now let's run the test cases again. Great, now it works. Let's submit the changes. Now that the intent of the code is even more clear, we can also try to improve the name of the class. So as the class seems to be a comparer, let's name it like this. This might not be a perfect name as well, but it definitely documents the responsibility of the class better. Let's quickly build the code and submit the changes. Reviewing the refactored code again, we can identify still quite some code duplication here and here. But there's also some other aspect which still puzzles me. I'm still not happy with the name of the class, which is usually an indicator that the responsibility of the class is not clear. And in fact, we see that this class has two responsibilities. On the one hand, it uses the exception parser to parse an exception text into some data structure, and it does some further parsing on its own. And on the other hand, it contains some logic here and here to compare two exceptions in a certain way. At that point, before doing any further refactoring on the code which does the comparison, we should first split these two responsibilities. But as this refactoring step has impact on our test safety net, let's first create some test API which acts as an anti-corruption layer between the test and the subject on the test. For simplicity reasons, we simply call that class test API, and we call the method this same exception ignoring test class. It takes the two exception texts and it simply creates our comparer and calls the same method. Now let's make the comparer internal and change our test code to use the test API. Let's quickly run the test cases and submit the changes. The tests are green, so let's submit. Now let's change our comparer class to take the exception info data structure instead of an exception text. We remove the usage of the parser and move it into the test API. And now we pass the exception info instead of the text. Of course, we also have to adapt the AP signature. And as the responsibility of the code got clearer, we can also slightly improve the name of the comparer class. And again, let's run the test cases and submit the changes. When we review the code again, we see that the responsibility of the class is now almost clear, except there is still some parser code left, which is this line and this one. So let's move this code into the parser class as well. Now we can remove this parsing logic here as well and use the stack trace property from the exception info directly. And here as well. Awesome! Now the whole code fits on a single screen page. And one more time, let's run all the test cases and submit the changes. At that point, I'm quite happy with this code, as it got much more explicit, much more compact, and the responsibility is cleaned up as well. Of course, there are further improvements we could consider. For example, we might want to move the regular expressions out of the comparer code and into the parser code. This might not only improve performance if we have to compare exception info objects over and over again, but it would also make it easier to test the proper parsing and interpretation of stack traces. But for this episode of Clean Code Review, we are done. We have seen that applying just a few clean code techniques lead to code which is easier to read, which is more expressive, and which can certainly be changed more easily in future. And if you enjoy such clean code reviews, then smash that like button and send me your code if you want me to review it. For that, please share the link to your GitHub project or your GitHub gist. You can find my email address in the channel info. See you in the next review.